Hello, we're here with Dominic Barrera, who's running for Port Commissioner, position number 2. Would you like to go ahead with your 2-minute introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all for making the time for me last minute. Really appreciate being here, opportunity to get my message out. I grew up in South King County. I was the son of an aircraft mechanic. I graduated from the University of Washington in 2012 and went to work for Alaska Airlines in airport operations in a union position that same year. So the port has always been central to my world, sustaining my life. And I'd like to point out that I'm 2 generations of proof just how important these frontline port positions are to the regional economy. I'm one of just about 90,000 people at SeaTac Airport alone, but a lot of the people who I work around are struggling, and it shows. And my neighbors in the Highline area living directly under the flight path within earshot of the seaport are struggling economically, facing poor health outcomes from the concentrated levels of pollution over decades in that area. And I really want to run for this position to bring that perspective to the Port of Seattle, to ensure that the prosperity of our ports is truly benefiting everybody who lives in the region. And in addition to working in airport operations, I also serve as a shop steward, a union representative for the IAM in my work group. I lead a small environmental nonprofit called Land Amnesty that's just based over at Magnuson Park. You may be familiar with our work. And I'm also an elected fire commissioner in the North Highline Fire District, representing a very diverse and complex area in Bright Center and Boulevard Park, where I live now. I want to use that breadth of experience to push the Port of Seattle to be a hub for good, safe, and secure jobs, a global leader in environmental stewardship and innovation, and just a good neighbor overall.
Great, thank you. And we are now on Matt. You read them before, so Matt.
What are your priorities and what do you plan to accomplish if you are elected?
So I think my top priority is really protecting and expanding the work conditions, labor standards at the Port of Seattle. So one example I have is the port is under the jurisdiction of SeaTac's minimum wage, but there is an exemption in that minimum wage that makes it so that it doesn't really apply to all workers. So I would try to push a resolution that makes that apply to all workers. Definitely stand up against any ploy to pay tipped workers less, for example. Right now, mandatory overtime is a very common thing there, even outside of irregular operations. And I think it presents a safety hazard and something that I would like to bring to the Port Commission to try to fix. Another thing would be investing in environmental, investing in technology and infrastructure that allows us to be better environmental stewards. Some of the things are already being done, but I really want to continue things like dockside, rail connections, and I love the idea of aviation biofuels, but SeaTac is so far behind in really being a leader in that area, and really push that. Another top priority of mine is ending human trafficking, and that's labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and you can really see the impacts of that when you talk to people who have worked in that area, and just driving around the airport area, you see the way it impacts the entire community.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
How should the Port Commission act to improve wages and working conditions for taxi drivers? In this era of Uber and Lyft, how does the Port address issues of access, equity, and fair wages for drivers?
You know, I'm not exactly sure of the mechanisms that they can have, but I think that we need to be a strong voice for allowing drivers to unionize. I would certainly stand up for any standards that we could put on wages. I think it only makes sense that drivers would be making a minimum wage equivalent to what is applied at SeaTac and in the area, and I know that that's not the case right now. Can I look at the question again?
Yes.
You can look at it now.
Yeah. I think it also goes beyond just Uber and Lyft, but also trying to find a way to protect the longer standing cab companies that are there and make sure that we have options of modes of transportation. I know plenty of people who actually prefer old style cabs, so different pickup areas.
Thank you, Jeff.
What opportunities do you see to advance the values of a Green New Deal at the port, supporting a strong local economy in ways that are environmentally sustainable and economically equitable?
I like this one a lot more. This is a little bit more my area. I think that the port really has everything that it needs to be this driver and leader. It's a very prosperous port. We can be investing in research and we can be investing in infrastructure. And I think that we should prioritize really stepping ahead of the curve and pushing that as much as we can. I'll mention aviation biofuels again, an area that needs more research and then needs more infrastructure investment at SeaTac in particular. I understand that a few airlines are willing to use it, but it's not readily available. So I think we should help it become readily available and then incentivize its use and eventually push the industry into that direction. And then in the seaport, again, I'll mention dockside rail connections, electrical outlets for ships, research is probably the biggest thing. Really identify the efficiencies, identify the new technologies, and take the steps to invest in them.
Thank you. Jason?
What infrastructure investments are needed to properly support the needs of the port?
I'll start at the airport because the Sustainable Airport Master Plan is under environmental review right now. I think that it is going in the right direction. Generally, I support the idea of the expansion of 19 new gates. I think that there are some issues with the plan that if there was somebody who worked in the operation who was there at the table helping make the plan, wouldn't be there. So I would really push for some revisions. Particularly there are some bottlenecks there of both car traffic and passenger traffic. But I also think that we need to be realistic about the limitations of SeaTac's footprint, and we need to start thinking about where air traffic is going to go beyond SeaTac and even beyond Payne Field. So I support the bill that was just signed into law to find a commission or to found a commission to identify some new sites, and then I would really push the Port of Seattle to be a partner in that and make it a regional network. In the seaport side, I would go back to the two things that I mentioned earlier. I think it's just so important to, once we identify the technologies that we can have, to really make it a priority to invest in them. Because again, Port of Seattle is a prosperous port and we're in a prosperous time, and now is the time to really start pushing those changes.
Great, thank you. And now we'll go open and get up to questions around the room. Leila, Matt, Jason, Elizabeth.
So you mentioned that one of your priorities is to focus on human trafficking and labor trafficking. What kind of ideas do you have to support that, to help end it?
So I think the first thing would be training. Well, first of all, it would be getting people at the port who are professionals in that area, and then training people of all whether they work for the port, whether they work for private companies, and training them to identify instances of that and how to respond to them. I went through a 5-minute computer-based training, and it was completely inadequate. And I don't think that really the people who I'm working around are prepared to respond to situations like that, and I just think that it needs to really be a top priority. Beyond training, I think that we should be utilizing whatever technology is out there as well.
And also as a club, I didn't hear where you worked.
I work for Alaska Airlines.
Alaska,
Yeah.
okay. But you said something about like a non-profit or something?
Yeah, I have 2 jobs. It's killing me. Yeah. So I work there at night, at the airport at night, and then during the day I'm an executive director for a nonprofit called Plain Amnesty.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Matt.
Do you think criminal history should be a barrier to jobs at the port?
I think it depends. I don't think that generally it should, but I don't think that we should be hiring a CFO who is convicted of embezzlement, for example. I think petty crime is one thing.
Can I ask you a clarifying question?
Sure.
So as of right now, if someone, say, gets out of prison and they go through a second chance culinary job training program, they're not eligible to work at any of the restaurants in SeaTac. So I'm not talking about a CFO, I'm talking about entry-level employment, where the port is one of the best paying employers in the area.
No, I don't think that should be a barrier. I support, or I am opposed to even asking that in an interview or in the application.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Jason?
I mean, with the port's history.
King County has this program when they hire people with developmental disabilities, and I know Commissioner Peter's done a fantastic job in taking lead on accessibility. What are your thoughts about hiring people with disabilities at the port, increasing that side of the employment in different departments?
Yeah, I think that would be a great job, a great way to engage people with certain disabilities, because there's just so much to do there. I think there's really ways to identify what is somebody's strengths, what are somebody's weaknesses, and find a way to funnel them into a job that they could really excel at. One thing is, there's people who go around in good directions, and I think that that's something that you could find someone who's really good at remembering where everything is and really good at engaging with people. Somebody who maybe wouldn't be in charge of security, and then there's somebody else who maybe you want to be watching that door.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
My understanding is that part of what the Port Commission does is help to keep businesses adjacent to the port thriving. I work with, I think, 330 some micro business owners who are all working and have their businesses in rented spaces adjacent to the port. And I'm wondering if you feel that it may be within the purview of the Port Commission to invest directly into micro businesses.
Yes, I absolutely do. The port actually just set up a fund for South King County assistance. And I think that that's the kind of thing that fund could be used for, because it hasn't been defined yet what it would be used for, but I think that certainly could. And, things like community centers and just generally things to help out the community around them. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So the port was tangled in the legal battle over 15. With your work in labor right now and your labor background, how do you see the port potentially being a labor leader and more of a friend toward union workers, of which the port employs so many?
Yeah, I think the first step is electing somebody to the commission who has a labor background. It's kind of a group that is filled with, or has historically been filled with pretty elite background people. And I think there's just been an awakening in recent years that we need to diversify our boards, not just in gender identity, not just in race and ethnicity, but also in the kind of backgrounds that people have, and that's really important to me.
Any other questions?
Would you support the Port Police joining in with law enforcement assisted diversion, and would the Port maybe, if it would be within your purview to pay for your officers to be trained and then to come in as a stakeholder?
Yeah, I would. I'm actually very proud of the Port police officers that I've worked with. I've seen them in action a lot, and I've actually always been very impressed with them, but I do think that training and just influencing the culture around police departments is very important, and I would fully support that. I think it's a worthy investment.
Excellent, thank you. I have a question, I guess. How to phrase this? I've heard that there's some issues surrounding contracts and for the vehicles at the airport that can transport folks with disabilities. Can you talk a little bit about what your idea might be for adding more vehicles?
I don't know about that specifically, but I certainly, I think with the traffic at the port, it's really something that needs to be addressed. I'm thinking about what about if somebody with a physical disability has to get to the light rail station, and that's a challenge. But even just getting across the sky bridge can be a challenge. So how can we prioritize which vehicles are going to the airport drive versus which are dropping elsewhere? Certainly something I'll look more into. Do you know the specific, like what's the company that?
We'll talk about
Okay.
that. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you. We still have a couple of minutes, huh? All right.
What is plant amnesty?
Plant Amnesty is a nonprofit that was founded by a woman named Cass Turnbull, an arborist, and it's a little bit hard to explain to people who aren't plant nerds, but it's it was.
Give it a try.
She said the mission was to stop the senseless torture and mutilation of trees and shrubs. Really meaning we need to take care of the trees around us, and what I've been spending most of my time doing or focusing a lot on is advocacy around the importance of preserving green space, and especially large trees that are capturing so much of the carbon, and in the port areas cutting noise pollution. So it's pretty dear to my heart in that area.
How can you bring that more to your port experience?
So one thing is the port owns a lot of land, and I think that identifying where those green spaces are. So I actually became involved in Plant Amnesty when I was a neighborhood activist in the White Center area, and Cass came down and was pushing a campaign to save the Myers parcels, which is a city-owned property. It was going to be sold to Lowe's for industrial development, and she wanted to turn it into a park, and I just wanted to help save it, not pave over it. So I got involved in that campaign. But I think things like that, where we can identify potential future green spaces that can be available for community use, and just make sure that they're not paved over for industrial use without thinking further about it, just because that's the short-term profit.
Excellent. Thank you. And we are ready for a 30-second wrap up.
Wait.
Are we ready?
Yeah.
Close to it.
Are we ready?
I think that the voters of King County have a really important decision to make this year. The Port Commission has long lacked representation from South King County, from the labor perspective, and I think this could finally be the time that we put someone on the board who brings the perspective of the neighborhoods most affected by Port Commission, most affected by port operations, And I believe the voters will agree with that, and I thank you all for having me here and the opportunity to get my message out.
Thank
Great,
you.
thank you.